We are going to move the show forward here. As always, we are very honored to be joined for this next segment by Vijay Prashad, who, among many other superlatives, is the executive director of the indispensable Tricontinental Institute. Vijay, thank you so much for being back with us.
And nice to be with you. Thanks a lot.
Well, I want to get to some of your thoughts about some of the things happening in Palestine, but I want to start in a different place. You've got the United States and the European Union trying to tee up $110 billion for Ukraine here at the end of the year, a little Christmas gift for Mr. Zelensky. They may not succeed, but in the face of almost every single person, even many people who are pro-Ukraine, saying the war is completely stalled and Ukraine can never win. I mean, what does it say that the United States and the European governments are still trying to pour in $110 billion?
Well, look, frankly, that war, that conflict has been going on now for so long. And with all the money and ammunition provided by the West to Ukraine, Ukraine has not been able to make advances into the Donbass region. It hasn't been able to push Russian forces back from the Crimea back to Russian borders. I mean, the fact of the matter is Russian troops entered that region to create a land bridge to Crimea. Russian forces entered that region to conduct some sort of political unification with the Donbass. That's about all that the Russians seem to be interested in. There wasn't really an interest in bombing Kiev. Mr. Zelensky went to the Argentinian president's inauguration. He then came to Washington, met not only Mr. Biden and congressional figures, but he also spent an afternoon hanging out with arms company executives. Well, how did Mr. Zelensky get to these places? He flew out of Kiev airport. And that is not an insignificant thing to say because, the way in which, for instance, the United States conducted its wars in Libya, in Afghanistan, Iraq, first thing you do is take out all the airports. Russians haven't done that. That's because it seems to me that it's not in their interest to conduct a war that is about annexing all of Ukraine. They had limited war aims. And in fact, if you judge them by their war aims, which is to hold the Donbass, hold the land bridge through Mariupol to Crimea, the Ukrainians haven't been able to push them out from that territory. In that sense, Russia has really got what it wanted and is not being ejected from there. So this is a strategic defeat for the Ukrainians. And that's the reason why many people around the world are saying, look, there needs to be a peace agreement. Forget the US Republican Party. That's just one phalanx of the right wing in the United States. Their hesitation about funding Ukraine has got to do with their own narrow political fantasy about building a giant wall on the US-Mexico border. They're not serious people. I don't take them seriously. More serious is the opposition growing in Europe, where there seems to be great sense of even dismay at the continuation of that war, which is why the European Union is expediting Ukraine's entry into the EU. They were even willing to pay the Hungarian government led by Viktor Orban what should effectively be called a bribe, so that Hungary no longer blackballs the ability of Ukraine from entering the European Union. Now with Donald Tusk back in power in Poland, there's another pro-Western guy in Eastern Europe. So Ukraine, I think, being brought into the European Union is not so much about the European Union and Ukraine. I think it's a lot about quelling the sense of dismay inside Europe, which is saying, hey, listen, we can't keep supporting the Ukrainians. In Germany, the far right and others gaining on some of these issues, making the center afraid. So I think that war, substantially, the Russians have got what they wanted. They are not being pushed back. A peace deal, I suppose, would be in order, but the West is never going to allow it because, as Lloyd Austin said in Kiev, the point of Western support for this is not to save the Ukrainians, it's to weaken Russia. It's just not happened.
Well, you're always talking about, Vijay, the battle of ideas. And in a post-October 7 world where there seems to be a reshuffle of what's important, where the US wants to be, where certain, I mean, before it was all Ukraine, Ukraine, Ukraine. And then West Africa was, on fire in a good way. And then you had, I mean, I don't even know what else happened this year. But now it's like, it's just been Gaza, 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 Gaza. And the world kind of like looking at the world through the lens of Gaza. And so I'm curious, in a post October 7 world where the US is trying to support Israel's genocide in Gaza while also still sending weapons to Ukraine, while also trying to maintain its great power competition with China, and also trying to maintain control of Latin America, maintain control of Africa, it just seems so overstretched. And Israel is like basically showing the world exactly what it's always been. Where are we at in the battle of ideas?
Well, I mean, let's go back to the question of Israel just to sharpen the point a little bit. It's very clear. Everybody now knows 18,000 civilians killed. I think what needs to be understood is 1,550 Palestinian families have lost multiple members. 320 Palestinian families. By the way, this number might seem small to people, but I want you to think about this. I'm not talking about individuals, I'm talking about families. And if you know the Palestinian family, it's about 10 people in a family, which is why 320 families in Gaza have lost more than 10 people. I mean, what the Israelis are conducting in Gaza, the aggregate number 18,000 tells you a lot, you understand? But the 320 families have lost more than 10 people. You can get the gravity of how the war is prosecuted. They are bombing entire buildings, bombing family homes, bombing neighborhoods, wiping out families. This is creating a kind of sociocide. Okay, the word we are using is genocide, but also Palestinian society is going to not be able to recover so easily. After the previous bombings of Gaza, 1,000 people dead, 1,500 people dead. Now, just these 320 families have lost cumulatively almost 4,000 people. Just these 320 families. That's 4 times the death toll from Operation Permanent Resolve. Just to put it in perspective, this is sociocide at a different level. Palestinian society is being attacked. In order for the Israelis to conduct what you got to understand as a permanent Nakba since 1948, what Israeli officials have called directly the Gaza Nakba. What I want to say about the broader question of the battle of ideas is between the conflict in Ukraine and this sociocidal, genocidal war in Gaza, between these two, there are a lot of clarities emerging for people, particularly in the global north. These clarities had been there before in the south. In fact, when the Ukraine conflict started, at that time, many leaders of the global south came out and said, we don't need to either support Russia or support the West. This is not our war. We have other conflicts. Why aren't you talking about our conflicts? Prime Minister of Namibia made this point directly at the Munich Security Summit. But now, even in the global north, there is a kind of clarity. Look at the reaction to the conflict in Ukraine and look at the poor reaction in the north to the conflict in Gaza. I must say, though, that at the same time, the inability of the Israelis with all this force to stop Hamas and other factions from responding is incredible. I mean, yesterday, 10 Israeli soldiers were killed. Yesterday, the United States informed the Lebanese government that Hezbollah must pull back from the dividing line that is there between Lebanon and Israel, to so-called come to resolution 1701, UN resolution 1701. Why? Because, in fact, the Israelis, despite this barrage backed by the United States, now slightly trying to temper that, despite all that, Hezbollah is still at the border, still contesting with the Israelis, and Hamas and others are still firing and killing yesterday 10 soldiers. So, this is a revelatory thing that these powers, whether it's the United States or Israel, they don't have the open field. There is indeed a major sense of weakness, and this has created clarities, not only in the global south, but certainly in the global north.
Well, one of the things, Vijay, that people are asking, and this is maybe a bridging issue between Ukraine and Palestine too, is will the Israelis be held accountable in front of the International Criminal Court, which, of course, when it comes to Ukraine, is willing to issue any indictment anytime. When it comes to Africa, will indict everyone in every orientation. But when it comes to Palestine, you had the head of the court, just sort of driving around Israel saying, "I'm not here to investigate anything, just to sensitize people," or whatever it was he said. So I guess the question I want to ask you to speak to is, one, is there value in the calls that people are making for the International Criminal Court to do something here? And two, how do you evaluate the reticence of the court to make any sort of representation on this issue that bears resemblance to previous situations they've intervened in?
Well, the first thing to remember is the Rome Statute, which is the treaty that produces the International Criminal Court, it was negotiated in good faith by the tens, hundreds of countries, 180 some countries that negotiated the Rome Statute. It came into effect in 2002. The very next year, the United States conducted an illegal war against Iraq. Nobody in the US administration, despite the fact that UN Secretary General Kofi Annan called it in public an illegal war, not one high official of the United States was indicted. There was no investigation brought before the International Criminal Court. Now, later in its history, prosecutor Fateh Bensouda several times said she wanted to open a file on the US war on Iraq, US war on Afghanistan, and the Israeli bombings of Gaza, several times. In fact, every time Ms. Bensouda opened a file, the US put immense pressure on her personally. What do I mean personally? John Bolton, National Security Advisor to the US government, in fact, publicly said that if Ms. Bensouda opens a file on the United States, the US government will never allow any of her family members to get a visa to come to the US. And in fact, if she needed to come and talk at the UN Security Council, they may not allow her to come. Imagine that kind of direct mafia-like pressure against the family of Fateh Bensouda. I mean, what do they have to do with her decisions at the court? Well, the current senior prosecutor, Karim Khan King's counsel, mind you, a British national, is a very conservative man. I mean, he comes from the Tory tradition in the UK. This is not even a Labour Party fellow. Karim Khan KC, in fact, came to the Rafah crossing early part of the war. He made some good statements saying aid needs to get through and so on. Let's not erase that from the record. Then he went on his little tour of Israel. Now, interestingly, let's go back to the start of the conflict in Ukraine. Weeks into the start of the conflict in Ukraine, pressure began to build up saying Mr. Putin and a member of his cabinet had moved Ukrainian children into Russia for safety. And then a warrant was put out in their names, calling them war criminals, saying they had conducted a war crime, which is transfer of population, in this case, children. And therefore, when Mr. Putin was to go for the BRICS meeting in Johannesburg, a lot of pressure for him not to go. He didn't go in the end. Sergei Lavrov went in his place. Imagine, they moved children from an active war zone. That earned Mr. Putin a warrant from that same court, the International Criminal Court. Now, Mr. Netanyahu, Yoav Gallant, other high officials of the Israeli government have directly been responsible for the murder of over 7,000 Palestinian children. Murder, not transfer of population. Murder of 7,000 children. They have been responsible for wiping out effectively 320 families. Not even an investigation from the International Criminal Court. Now, but I still think, Eugene, going to your question, I still think it's important for people to bang on the door of the International Criminal Court in The Hague. Why? Because the International Criminal Court is a court produced by an internationally negotiated treaty, the Rome Statute. We must demand the right for the Rome Statute to be enacted. Mr. Karim Khan KC is not a king. He's not like some, nobleman who makes his own decisions. They must be held accountable to world opinion. we must continue to bang at their door.
Oh, sorry, go ahead, Rania.
No. Go ahead.
I was just going to
We
say
could do this all
briefly.
day.
I was just going to say briefly, Vijay, since Rania did bring up the Battle of Ideas, you're also with Leftward Books. You guys have just put out a new piece, Decolonizing the Palestinian Mind. I was hoping you could just talk about that book a little bit as well.
It's interesting. Haider Eid is a professor of literature at Gaza University. About a year and a half, 2 years ago, Haider sent me his manuscript saying, look, I'm having a hard time getting this book published. Will you guys do it? You guys seem to not be afraid of the backlash from all sides. And, Haider Eid is a very important and important voice, not only from Gaza, but of Palestine, very critical of Oslo, coming out of the tradition of Edward Said's statement that the Oslo Accord was a Palestinian Versailles, a surrender to the Israelis. He comes out of that tradition. He sent me a book which was incredible. It was basically making an argument to go beyond the Oslo Accords. Well, I was like, this conflict has heated up. And Heather sent voice notes saying that, he was trapped in Gaza, 2 young daughters, family, scared. Eventually, they moved slightly south. As the Israelis kept lying to the Palestinians, telling them, go along Salahdin Street, go to Khan Yunis, go to Rafah. Every time Palestinians, and 85% of Gaza has been displaced, by the way, every time Palestinians moved further south on Salahdin Street, the Israelis followed and bombed, and are now telling them to go to this tiny enclave, an old Palestinian Bedouin village on the edge of the Mediterranean. So while he was being chased out towards Rafah, he sent me audio notes, which we made into the preface to the book. It's a very beautiful opening of the book. He talks about standing aloft and looking at all of Gaza. It's a very moving book. The book itself is tremendous, and I'm very proud that we, Leftward Books, far away in Delhi, were given, he trusted us, this Palestinian writer, for us to be the publisher. Fortunately, Haider Eid and his family were able to leave Gaza because he's a dual national, also a South African national. And I got to commend the South African government, because the South African government went all out to get their nationals out of Gaza and bring them to South Africa. The South African government also, by the way, has been out there, calling for an ICC investigation, calling this genocide and so on. And therefore, Heather is in South Africa. We're going to do a lot of events about that book, Eugene, and I very much hope people will go to leftward.com and be able to have a look at it.
Well, I hope they can as well. It looks like a fantastic book. I've never been let down by anything from Leftward Books, and I know I won't be this time. Vijay Prashad, Executive Director of the Tricontinental Institute, thank you so much for some of your time here on the Freedom Side.
Thanks a lot, guys. Take care of yourself.